It is 2:40 a.m. in the morning, as has so often been the case during this experience. What it has caused me to reflect on has disturbed me so much that I couldn't sleep. That is the case now, and instead of laying awake in bed, getting frustrated, I thought I would take the chance to use, whatever productive time I have, considering how late it is. You never know. I might record something, or evidently with you watching this, I found that something useful could even be recorded at this hour. So this is the final drive through the latest sort of contemporary instance of a picture with wrinkles in it, if I can put it that way, in contemporary times, happening right now, regarding how the engineering consulting industry conducts itself across the world in places where people are listening and looking closely. For example, in their own backyards, in the UK or the US or Australia or anywhere really. And also where perhaps people with power, at least, are not so often listening or looking, which is not to say that no one is listening or looking, but those people may not have the power to act on what they observe. So for those who have been sort of watching on LinkedIn, you may have seen that I have sort of settled on a structure for this investigation. And that's an important, brings up an important concept. Yes, this is an investigation. I am conducting this as a news reporter. Yes, I have had a career in this industry in 6 countries now. I have, therefore, motivation from that series of experiences. And I think for those who have watched, the 7 episodes on Kuwait, for example, may even understand how motivating those atrocities that I observe may be. To do some sort of investigation, but it's important to say that for what I'm doing here, I will behave as a reporter. I will only consider public information that's been revealed by other reporters or the companies themselves, governments, the UN, things like that. The reason for taking this approach is that I want to retain my capacity to speak. If I break the law, if I breach a confidentiality agreement from any of the employers that I have had in the past, this may result in legal outcomes that are incredibly severe, but principally the outcome may be that I lose my right to speak. And what I have observed tells me that we need as many people with the right to speak who are using that right. Okay, so the structure that I have devised starts with a survey of the human rights and policies and codes of conduct for the, as far as I can tell, 9 publicly traded engineering consultancies that are in some way delivering on the collection of projects in Tabuk province in Saudi Arabia called NEOM. And the most famous of those projects is called The Line, which supposedly will be eventually a 170 kilometer, supposedly will be eventually a 170 kilometer long city, about 500 meters wide only, and of the order of 800 or 500 meters high. But is now, the scope now has been brought back to only 2.4 kilometers long. There has been a lot of news coverage about this project, in credible, high-profile newspapers like the Wall Street Journal, and also national sources like the BBC. So why should I be looking into the human rights policies and codes of conduct of these firms? Well, simply because reporting by journalists from these aforementioned media organizations and from the UN paints a picture of grave concern. Funnily enough, that picture began to be painted actually by the likes of Jamal Khashoggi, who was killed by the Saudi state for using his right as an American to speak freely. Something that he had to say on Al Jazeera about NEOM was that there was a risk that it could bankrupt Saudi Arabia because it would involve spending so much money. And not too many months after saying so, he was found to have been killed in the Saudi embassy in Turkey. So, that sort of thing, of course, grabs one's attention. But there, just to round out the picture a bit more for you, there was also a BBC report of a tribal landowner who refused to give up his land for the NEOM projects. And as was reported by the likes of Merlin Thomas at the BBC, there was a Saudi colonel who was instructed by the government to take his men into that village and, if necessary, kill those villagers if they refused to leave their land. And Merlin Thomas, interviewed this colonel, and he decided to escape from Saudi Arabia to live in the UK so that he did not have to conduct that mission. Nevertheless, others were not so strong-willed, did not have such a moral conscience, were not so courageous, and did lead some Saudi security forces into those villages and did kill one of them. Furthermore, there were eventually 5 men put on death row as punishment for opposing the acquisition of their land. An interesting detail that I discovered is that the man who was killed actually worked in a financial capacity in the Saudi government. So it's an interesting connection with what Jamal Khashoggi had to say in his observations about, the dangerous cost overruns, risk of cost overruns of this project. And the fact that the man who took a stand and paid the ultimate price, in fact, had a position of responsibility in local government to do with finances. So now I have illustrated a concerning circumstance for you. And this was all, played out years ago, early 2020s, and was reported in detail at the time by, for example, a respected security correspondent for the BBC, Frank Gardner, who happens to be wheelchair bound after years before this reporting on another story going to Saudi Arabia and being shot in the legs by terrorists there and, disabled. So it is surely a message worth listening to. A journalist of his caliber who has seen what he has seen on other stories in the same country, coming back for more and writing a story like this, talking about the terrorization of these tribal landowners, about this very high in preparation for this very high profile project. So it is for these reasons that, and also observing that there are these 9 publicly traded engineering consultancies that nevertheless chose to get involved in this project despite these atrocities in its beginning. It is for that reason that I am choosing to begin this investigation, again, as a news reporter, reviewing public information that these companies put out on their websites. It is for these reasons that I am choosing to start by just checking through the text of each of these human rights policies and codes of conduct to, in fact, begin in a positive way to celebrate the existence of these policies and codes of conduct, and particularly to celebrate that they contain a recognition of the human rights of people and communities in the places where these consultancies do their work. Once we have conducted that review, then I will move on to what UN special reporters have discovered in Saudi Arabia. I will also move on to the letters of urgent appeal that the UN has issued to the countries where these consultancies come from and to several of these consultancies themselves. There is a publicly available database of these letters of urgent appeal that the UN has issued. That database contains also, importantly, the replies from these countries and these companies in some cases. I say in some cases because, interestingly, several of these companies have not, for years, deigned to reply to something as severe as a letter of urgent appeal from the UN relating to this project. Again, the reality of doing this now at 2:54 a.m. Is hitting me. Okay, so once we have reviewed this, again, publicly available material from the UN, in contrast with the first step, which is to check the contents of the human rights policies and codes of conduct of these 9 companies. Yes, we will check what the UN says. Next up, we will check what these news reporters from the Wall Street Journal, the Guardian, the BBC, along with there's a podcast recently from the Wall Street Journal, which contains some interesting extra detail. I will share my screen with the nice clip. Nice, I mean, what can I say? Poignant, I will use that word. Clip from Jamal Khashoggi with that quote of his from his appearance on Al Jazeera. So we will do a comprehensive review of this credible, publicly available, investigative journalist reporting about this project and some of the controversies. Importantly, in that review, we will look at the timeline and the dates when the earlier articles were released. Why is that? because the next phase will be to look at the public announcements by these companies of the projects and other forms of involvement that they have with NEOM and this portfolio of projects. And we will contrast the dates of those announcements with the dates of the news reporting about human rights concerns on these projects. And that will help us in understanding the contrast between these announcements about getting involved in these projects and the publicly available human rights policies and codes of conduct from these companies. Finally, we will also look at public job boards showing employment opportunities at these companies on these projects to provide as full of a picture as we can about the contemporary hiring situation that these companies have as a to round out the picture beyond the announcements that they might make to the stock exchange or the media about involvement in these projects, just to show that the level of commitment within these firms to this project. Perhaps I should comment on motivations. So perhaps it is a cheap comment to make, but I am a GISP holder or a Geographic Information Systems professional. I have a certification after having passed a portfolio review and an exam from the GIS Certification Institute in the US, which itself involves a code of conduct and a code of ethics. So everything that I do as a representative of that certification before the public carries with it the weight of having to live up to that certification. So that's an important initial comment, that the value of being a GISP is that it causes there to be in the world people who are motivated for the purpose of retaining their certification to pay close attention to ethical and human rights concerns in our industry. There must be people who are using their power to do the difficult things and answer the difficult questions. That is the first comment about why I am doing this. Needless to say, there is the human element. Nobody wants there to be in the world a victimized, poor, powerless people. Nobody wants that. So I am simply being a regular human being here, using what power I have to advocate on behalf of those who do not appear to have enough power to address the injustices that they face. A final motivation is love, commitment, and total dedication to the degree of becoming a virtuoso in my beloved geospatial industry and profession. If I have in the back of my mind that I may be contributing to a human rights atrocity through deliberate acts or silence or turning a blind eye, that means I cannot ultimately be a virtuoso. Becoming a virtuoso involves total dedication, total concentration, absolute focus. It is a 100% every waking second level of commitment. And I am speaking not only for myself, but everyone in saying that it is incredibly difficult to become really good at what one is doing if one is distracted. And a great source of distraction is if there is a background sense of basic humanity being denied. So I am directly confronting a situation where basic humanity appears to have been denied, and I'm using what power I have, admitting that I as an individual have insufficient power. Nevertheless, I have insufficient power to totally solve the situation, but nevertheless using what power I do have to do what I can to contribute to a better situation in this instance. Perhaps through viewing or listening to what I have to say, others will contribute their power also. Through a collection of power, perhaps this issue will be resolved, and the result will be a more effective profession, a more useful geospatial industry, because it will contain more people able to unleash themselves without fear and doubt that what they are doing is bad for vulnerable people. And another source of motivation is a history in the past century that affects many of us. That is World War II. Why go back so far? Simply because an outcome of World War II was the UN. And pretty promptly, as discussed in an episode not too long ago with Valerie Grant, a prompt outcome of the formation of the UN was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That then provided some clarity for how humanity would go about ensuring that vulnerable people would be respected. As I said at the beginning of this comment, I and so many of us around the world have a direct connection to World War II. I will describe the basis for my connection using stories from my family and the family of my wife. I will start with the family of my wife. One of my wife's grandmothers was born in a camp in Hungary. This was after her family was kicked off their land. Yes, there is a theme of evictions from land and land rights issues in this series of episodes. Her family was kicked off their land in Serbia by the Hungarians during World War II and sent 400 odd kilometers northwest to a camp. They were there for years. At one point, there was a mercy mission organized by religious folk in Serbia to bring approximately 14 or 1,500 mothers and children back to Serbia to live with families here, where I am currently recording in Serbia, away from the camp. Grandmother was not so lucky to be rescued in that mercy mission, but one of her brothers was. Another younger brother of hers, who along with her stayed in the camp, died of starvation. There was not enough food to keep both babies alive from her family in the camp. Thankfully, she survived, and eventually, after the liberation, came back to Serbia, back to the area where they were kicked off their land, and has lived a life here. It is a responsibility of mine and of all of us who are descendants to listen to, understand, and respect the enormity of this injustice and what we as a collective, for example, represented by the UN, have decided to do to ensure these injustices do not occur again. And I believe it is Article 17 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that directly speaks about land ownership and that people have a right to own private property, for example, land. So there is a direct connection to these men and women, families, children, being evicted without due process under conditions of terror, where there is a risk of being shot to death. There is a direct connection to so many families who also lost their land during World War II, and an instance of the same violations in modern times for a people, a tribal people in rural, outback Saudi Arabia, who, yes, may dress differently to us, may have a different skin color, have a different religion. Nevertheless, what humanity decided after World War II was that they are just as human as all of us. They're just as human as those living in Chile, just as human as those living in Bulgaria, just as human indeed as those in Serbia, evicted from their land temporarily by the Hungarians during World War II. What we decided to do, learning the lessons of World War II, was to issue a statement that applies to all about our basic rights. So as someone who has married into a family who has suffered in this way, I must speak so that is my wife's connection to this circumstance. On my side of the family, my grandfather was sent from Australia to serve initially in the headquarters of the Australian Army's World War II operations in London. He served there for a few years, and then he was deployed to the Middle East. I don't know exactly if he went to Saudi Arabia, but it's interesting. In my life, I've also, in a commercial and consulting sense, deployed to the Middle East a few times. A couple of generations ago in my family, for him, it was a military deployment. As happens in war, governments, cultures will produce artifacts that celebrate and honor those who served. Of course, for the purpose of making sure we do not forget the sacrifice, in some instances, the ultimate sacrifice that our countrymen and women made. It is also to these cultural artifacts, for example, music, poems, stories, films, and statues. They will celebrate or commemorate what was done. And often there is a whole series of war memorials throughout each country, reminding people in their everyday lives of what occurred. So in the Australian context, the main one in a national sense is the Australian War Memorial in the capital city, Canberra. It just so happened that a sculptor, an Australian sculptor named Barbara Tribe, met my grandfather when he was deployed in London, and she made a bust of him, a plaster bust. It was commissioned by the Australian government as a series. So there were several soldiers that she made busts of. One of them was my grandfather. That bust made of plaster was then used to create a bronze bust, and that appears in the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. When I went to work in London, starting 2021, I went and bought that plaster bust from the Armoury of St. James in London, just a great name, who owned it after buying items in an auction from the estate of Barbara Tribe when she died. So that bust was sitting in this antique dealer for several years, and many members of my family were aware of it. Many discussions happened about buying it and shipping it back to Australia. But they often stopped, or they basically stopped when everyone realized the cost of shipping the thing. But I realized it was my opportunity to bring it into the family when I went to live and work in London. So I dutifully did, and brought it all the way from London to Bristol, where we were working. And it's basically accompanied my family in the corner of our living room in whatever apartment we've been living in. And yes, I can attest again to the shipping costs. It was basically £1,000 to send it from London to Atlanta, where we now live. Nevertheless, this is what happens and what must be done when you have this kind of a connection to such an event as World War II. And it is a very powerful, needless to say, reminder of really what is serious and what is not. Really, who is serious and who is not. Having this bust at all times, almost participating in family life, there in the corner in our living room. And it helps me to understand what I must focus my attention on and what I should be afraid of and what I shouldn't be afraid of. So that is the contribution to the future that I believe the Australian government wanted to make through honouring these servicemen and women. It was a series of servicemen in this case in these busts, through commissioning these sculptures and placing them, for example, in the War Memorial, and me somehow grabbing my own, the original really, and fashioning my own especially concentrated version of this effect in our family and in our apartment. So what that bust really says to me is that this was a man in my family who was shipped across the world to fight in a war that the whole world was involved in. I have never seen those kinds of conflicts and that kind of mortal risk really in my life. Yes, I've come across, as I related in my testimony about Kuwait, I've come across some atrocities, but it was nothing like what my grandfather saw for years, and that affected him, that traumatized him for the rest of his life when he worked as a dairy farmer, subsequently raising my father and my uncles and aunt in Australia. It tells me, this bust, that yes, it may look like I am confronted with threatening people who have power, but they are nothing in the context of what my grandfather confronted in that war. And it has to be said, on a whole nother level, what my grandmother-in-law confronted, being born in a camp in World War II. And before she was even aware of it, as an infant, losing her baby brother because he starved to death in that camp. Those connections that I have are not unique to World War II, because it was a world war. And there are millions of us, really all of us, are descendants of family members who fought, some who died, some who lost their land, all probably traumatized. So again, it is not okay for us to be made to feel afraid of fearlessly, if necessary, fearsomely applying what we as a collective all decided to do through starting the UN and promptly setting about writing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which contains an article specifically about the right to own property, for example, land. That's the starting point for everything we do every day. And we have a right to it, because all of us fought that war and none of us want it to happen again. None of us want it to happen again. My grandmother-in-law deserves to know that the family she has brought to life, considering the start in life she had, and the baby brother she lost to starvation, deserves to know that all of the effort she has put in her life, struggling against the odds in post-war Serbia, which has subsequently suffered another war, she deserves to know that that effort and sacrifice she made has produced courageous people. Hell, just people who don't forget. Okay, so that is my introductory set of remarks. That will serve as its own episode. Yeah, I'll stop recording now. See you in the next one. Thanks for listening.